guys.
Happy New Year to you. Welcome to 2026.
Man,
I know,
2026. We're in the second quarter of the 21st century, if you can believe it.
I
Just
didn't realize
barely
that's
on.
true. I was just going to say we've completed another lap around the sun.
I was going to say
you guys-
big 2-6, but you know,
Yeah,
thanks for making me feel depressed on a Friday.
Misery
Well,
loves
you woke
company.
up. We just pointed it out.
We're just fanning the flame.
Yeah.
What were you guys doing for Y2K? I was talking about this with my wife on the new year. What was happening in the year 2000? Brandon was
Wow.
probably 12.
I was old enough.
I was 14, so I wasn't much older.
It's like a really weird. I was
9.
And I just remember being allowed to stay up till midnight and wanting to go outside and bang pots and pans. And my mom being like really nervous about that, having nothing to do with Y2K, but just the concept of being outside at midnight and banging on pots and pans. But we did it. We talked her into it and then quickly went back inside.
Where were you living at the time?
I was in Westchester, Pennsylvania,
Westchester.
in the township, West Goshen Township.
My
West
mother was the
Coast.
same way. She was a nervous wreck. And,
Yeah.
you know, we had the tradition go outside, bang some pots and pans, you know,
Yeah.
do some poppers.
Yeah.
I've talked to my dad about it. Like, obviously, Y2K is a thing that talks about. And I was like, were you really nervous? He's like, not really. I was like, what did you do? He's like, I went to the bank on New Year's Eve and I got a bank statement as of that day of these are my holdings. And he was like, I just figured if there's something that happens crazy overnight, I'll have proof.
It is funny. Can you imagine like the Y2K crisis happening now in the era of social media where the
Oh my God.
smallest conspiracy becomes the largest existential threat known to man?
I feel like we deal with that all the time. I mean, how
Yeah,
many
there would be
residents do you guys talk
protests
to
and
where they're
riots.
like, yeah, I read about this on Facebook, therefore it must be true. And it's like, yeah, I saw that on Facebook too. And it's definitely not true.
And
Abraham
my
Lincoln said you could trust anything online.
Yeah.
I mean, my memories of Y2K were that like the media was hyping up this sort of like potential cataclysmic event, but most people were like your dad shrugging it off. I'll do a little bit of prep work just in the outside chance that airplanes fall from the sky. The big issue was the 99 in the coding was going to turn over to a 00. And for
Right.
one reason or the other, the media hyped that up into this like we're gonna go back to 1900 and the computers are gonna suddenly think that they don't exist anymore. I don't really know what the driving force was behind the conspiracy theories, but
I
never
talk about something on New Year's Eve.
and it was something to latch onto for
And
sure.
like you
We
said,
were-
misery loves companies. But the more, you know, miserable the news, chances are the wider spread it is.
All right, well, you guys
What a
want to get
depressing
going?
first conversation into Generation on
Thanks,
the Rise
Dave.
into
You
the
know-
new year. Yeah, Dave, really appreciate that. Welcome back.
Welcome to our listeners. Greetings, everybody. This is our kickoff 2026 episode of Generation on the Rise. This is the podcast where we are talking about all things local government, all things municipal management, and we are doing so through the lens of that up and coming next generation of leaders in our industry and leaders of all ages and stages in their career. We are the Pep Boys, Manny, Mo, and Jack, also known as Dave Probulka, Brandon Ford, and Eden Ratliff. I am going to be your host for the day, and we are going to dive right into the topic shortly. But before we do, let me remind our listeners that the comments and expressions you are about to hear are ours and ours alone and do not necessarily reflect those of the many fine organizations and institutions that employ us. That includes ICMA, Association of Pennsylvania Municipal Management, Pennsylvania Municipal League, and of course, the starting lineup of the 1972 San Diego Chargers. Fellas, Happy New Year. Let me start. This is not the subject of the day, but I am curious. How do you guys kick off your new year? What are the first things you're doing when you're coming back, maybe from a vacation or your staff's getting back into the office? What's your first?
I typically do my usual walk around, but I take a little bit longer and I just go talk to people. The last 2 weeks of the year, it was like ghost town in this building. There was nobody here. And it was kind of weird, surreal, that first Monday back when we were fully staffed. Everyone was here. It was like night and day.
So you're just getting out there and catching up and seeing
Shaking
what
hands, meeting
has
people,
been occupying.
that kind of stuff.
How about you, Eden? What do you do?
Brandon walking through his township building. I feel like it's like a celebrity. Like he's just walking through. People are like, oh, Brandon is here. Oh, Happy New Year. Like that's just what I envision, Dave. I don't know about you.
For
Just
sure.
to add to that, my predecessor didn't do that. So when I got hired here and I started doing that, I legitimately freaked people out. They
I'm
thought
sure you did.
everyone was in trouble.
You
all
have
the
that
time.
kind of personality sometimes.
Am I
Kidding.
not scary?
No.
I know that exact impact. Like when you're replacing somebody who maybe didn't have that management by walking around strategy, and then you start to initiate that, you do get a lot of nervous looks when you're coming into the office. When they realize that you're just coming in there to shoot the breeze or learn about them or whatever, it's a little refreshing.
Yeah, I do the same thing. For those who maybe aren't from Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania runs on a calendar year process. So we're calendar year budgets. We reorganize the first Monday in January. So we're all having reorg meetings, swearing in new elected officials, figuring out the new leadership of the board, all that kind of stuff. In December, between wrapping up the budget and getting ready for reorg, a lot of people were going to take those 2 weeks off, which it was sort of a ghost town around here, Brandon. There's like all of this prep and all this excitement, and then everyone sort of leaves. I came back the Friday before January 2nd this year and did the walk around thing and said, how was your New Year's? This was my New Year's. How was your holidays? And just sort of do all of that kind of stuff so that when we got back on the 5th, we were ready. This place was cooking on the 2nd, and on the 5th, it definitely was coming. We had a really big reorg. We had over 100 people here celebrating.
Nice.
The outcomes of the elections and the reorganization of the board. There's a lot of prep that went into that. I was joking at home that New Year, like January 1st is obviously the new year, but for me, it feels like it happens on January 5th at reorg because that's when it kicks off the new year with the new elected officials. Channeling energy there and trying to bang on the shoulder pads of the team. Like, all right, we're into the new year. Hopefully we're rested and relaxed and ready to take on the challenges of the new year and what all that brings.
I'm right there with you. I think you kick off the new year, get it off to a good foot, try on a good foot. You try to be sociable, be welcoming, kind of set the tone, hopefully for the rest of that year. For me, early on, my initial meetings with my leadership team, at least, is really agenda setting, priority setting. Okay, what are our goals for the new year? How are we going to kind of lay that out strategically from, the standpoint of, what are we going to be doing January, February, March? What are we going to be doing, as we get into the middle of the year? And then how are we going to sort of close it out? For me, I'm not a naturally organized person, so I've got to kind of force myself into that compartment where I'm being a little bit more aggressively organized. I'm trying to straighten my life out, clean my desk off, file things away, that kind of feng shui that you need in your office to really kind of get out in a good mood.
Oh, Dave, I actually have a tradition where I will work a couple days after Christmas where it gets dead. And I'll dedicate 1 or 2 days, and I call them purge. And everyone knows it's my purge. And I will basically take paper recycling bin and drag it into my office. And I will go through every single drawer, every single pile that has slowly accumulated over the year. And everyone knows it's Brandon's purge day. And I'll just go through and refile and I'll get my life in order.
That's so funny. I operate mainly on paperless files, guys, because it's 2026. So feel free to get with the program. I carry a notebook around and I write a lot in that notebook that gets transcribed into paperless too. But yet I still manage to have a messy office. Like every week when we record this podcast, before I log on, I sort of look at my background. I'm like, oh, my office looks so messy. And I blur my background, as you guys can tell.
If
and
it's
I'm like,
blurred,
well, this week I'll do something about it. And it still doesn't happen. But being paperless and having a messy office, I don't know how that happened. It's like if I brought in a recycling bin, I'm not sure that would fix the issue.
Embrace the purge.
That's the question.
It's the natural entropy of office life. Yeah. You can try to fight it. You can try to get ready for it, but inevitably it's going to take control. So with the new year, we got some new elected officials. I'm sure a lot of us, we've got new priorities. We've got new agendas. I thought this would be a great chance for us to talk about the formation of public policy. What's the manager's role in it? We all kind of have this very textbook understanding of, council manager form of government and how we integrate in the policy formation process overall. So let's start there. Brandon, you're an ICMA guy through and through, so I thought we would start with you. Tell us what your textbook definition is of the manager's role in policy formation.
I will be the first to share that my definition of that role has changed over the years. Going through grad school, they teach you about the dichotomy. You're either admin or you're politics. Manager's role should just be on the admin. But as you all can agree or disagree, as we've been in the trenches, the manager does play a role in policy formation. We don't vote on policy, but oftentimes it's the manager and assistant manager explaining to the elected official what's possible. We don't lead our board, but we outline options, right? You've heard me go on about leaf blowers.
Far too long. My siblings are enthralled by that conversation, by the way.
You know what? And I went back home to Scranton, and I had my relatives asking me about Lower Merion's leaf blower ban.
You said that was your Christmas gift to your relatives. Yeah. New leaf blowers, right?
That's what I heard. 2-stroke gas-powered diesel leaf blower.
Oh, geez, Dave. Come on. His employers are listening to this.
When our board goes through a priority setting, which outlines their goals, they're like, hey, we want a leaf blower ban.
I'm
And
trying to
then,
figure out your
and then it
role
was,
in that process.
yeah, we took that goal of leaf blower ban and we ran with it internally as a staff. We developed a policy, the options, and ultimately came up with a recommendation for a seasonal ban. Now, here's the nice thing about policy formation in a democracy. Our board didn't agree with our recommendation. Our board said, we'll do a seasonal ban short term, but we want a full ban. Right. So we gave an option, our recommendation, and our board added to it.
Now, I want to get into the disagreements that emerge between the CAO and the Board of Commissioners, Supervisors, Council, whatever it may be. So put a bookmark in that. But Eden, do you have anything you want to add?
Book in this episode scare me because we keep going and we never come back.
I know we're gonna have to do an episode just on the bookmarks.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's keeping log. But...
No, I definitely want to hit on when the manager and the elected body disagree on policy and how those recommendations and subsequent implementation materialize and take shape. But I do want to give you a chance to have the mic, Eden, on that first question.
What was the question?
What's the textbook definition of the manager and his or her role in public policy formation? We'll branch from there.
Well, I didn't bring a textbook to this episode, just so you know. I think the manager's role in public policy formation probably takes a different shape in every community and sort of depends on, sort of how the office of the CAO is formed in that community. I think there's a lot of similarities across our communities, but it's different depending on the size of your community, where you are in the country, sort of how active or proactive your governing body is. I think generally speaking, I'm pretty aware of what the policy priorities are of my governing body. We have intentional conversations. We speak them in plain English in public meetings and I try to get what that policy direction is more broadly adopted through master plans and other planning documents and work with them, especially during budget development, on what the specifics of outcomes look like and what their goals are. And then I think our job as a team that I certainly lead in my organization is figuring out what those options are, make sure we're presenting data to support the different options, pro cons, and then present them to the governing body so they can sort of say, okay, let's go this direction, or throw them all out, which definitely happens. I say all the time, the manager's job is really difficult, but one of the difficult things we don't have to do is decide what that policy is. Our job is to inform the process, respect the outcome, and then deliver with enthusiasm.
Managers do control the agenda to a degree, don't you? I mean, have you ever been part of a community where your board chairperson is actually writing the agenda, or has that always been you as the manager working with your staff direction?
Pennsylvania is quite clear that the agenda is set by the board chair. So I have a meeting with the draft agenda with my board chair and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. The portion of the agenda that the manager controls is sort of the operational things, like the things that we need to present to the board, that they need to consider, land development stuff that's coming up from the PC, bill list, purchasing, all that sort of stuff. But the policy portions are them. I've got two that are on my agenda, our business meeting this coming Monday, that the board put there. I didn't put them there. We need to update the sign ordinance in our community because there's a new Supreme Court case to deal with temporary signs and political signs. That wasn't us. We're certainly informing that discussion, but that was a result of a discussion of the governing body and the solicitor. And another one is a public policy comment, a public comment policy for the Board of Supervisors. Yeah, that's not me. I mean, I'm not driving that conversation. These are board meetings, not manager meetings.
But how do you,
I'm not
how
sure
do
if I
you
answered your
define
question,
then?
Dave, but
No, I think you did. I mean, how do you define? It's interesting to think about the definition of public policy because just about everything is sort of policy driven, even if it's something like buying a piece of capital equipment. The genesis of that was in your budget development. It was in your capital improvement planning. It really does have roots in what I would call public policy. We want to take care of our streets. That's our policy. We want to maintain our parks, whatever the application. Yeah.
But I think I'm coming at this from the bias of being in an urban suburban community. But I would not think that capital equipment is a policy decision of the governing body.
I mean, they're going
to have to approve it in the sense that they're adopting a budget, which is allocating resources to it. And the budget is certainly a policy document. I think the reality is maybe in a small town where there's really not a lot of money to go around and they really are beating up, do we buy an excavator or don't we? But I think ultimately, like I tell my board, I'm not sure that it makes sense in a community of this complexity and size to be debating whether or not we should be replacing police cars. We have a robust police department that provides a lot of both reactive and proactive police services with a community policing model. Like they're going to need vehicles. We have a vehicle replacement schedule and program that is funded in the budget. It calls for these 5 vehicles to be replaced. The mechanic signed off on that. we have the funding for it in budget, we're just going to move on and do that. I mean, that's not the highest and best use of a part-time governing body's time in a public meeting to be discussing.
But
So
you could have a policy that says as vehicles or capital equipment come off the rolls and are being replaced, that we would explore new technology, greener technology, and convert to all renewable
Sure. Yeah, that
consumption.
could happen.
We have that here in Lower Merion.
I think we're defining policy differently.
Well, I think policy has a broad definition. I mean,
I agree.
and
So what are we talking
that's
about?
really, well, I want to get into that. You raise a good point about the part-time governing board. I was thinking about this in the lead up to this episode. Do you think there's a difference between the CAOs of municipalities, municipal manager, or the CAOs or CEOs of a nonprofit board and those that exist in a for-profit space? If you're a for-profit chief executive officer who has a board of directors, I think commonly, and maybe this is a generalization, but I think it's true, that board of directors is full of subject matter experts that are familiar with that particular organization, that have a working knowledge of it, have a history in there. We've got elected officials that are coming to the table. I've served on nonprofit boards, I've chaired nonprofit boards that are coming to the table with maybe a broad breadth of experiences that might not have anything to do with the mission of that particular organization they're being asked to lead. So do you think there's a difference in how that involvement in policy formation applies in the nonprofit municipal space versus some of the other for-profit organizations out there?
I think it depends on the organization rather than the sector, whether you're a nonprofit or a political entity.
What were you going to say, Dave?
The purpose of this question is really because I want to push the envelope a little bit on that textbook definition, which we appropriately described as, CAO manager is the recommending body. We're often the translator. We're taking feedback from our leadership team and our staff and bringing it forward to the elected officials in a way that they can digest and understand, form that public policy, which then, kind of reciprocates back to the manager with the responsibility to administer and implement. But we all know that this world is a little bit more complex than that. Brandon, you illustrated the point about the leaf blowers, which I know we've talked about ad nauseum here, but I think it's really apropos. Let me ask you this. Have you ever taken a decision of your governing body that's contrary to your recommendation personally? Have you ever let it affect, your mood, your mindset, your mentality, your attitude? And tell me about it.
No, right? Regardless of whether I agree with it or not.
Really? You've never had personal feelings at home that you have to process
At
about
home,
the governing bodies?
My wife would tell you that I've had moments where I disagreed with this, and I think that's not the greatest.
Yeah,
decision.
never in Middletown. Never in Middletown. But I definitely gone home and been like, yeah, so that decision was crazy. I can't believe they did that. That's a personal belief. And when we say in the sports world, you let that go and move on. I think in order to be an effective municipal manager, you have to understand your role and appreciate the balance we have. Being an elected official is really difficult. They have an immensely difficult role. They feel a lot of pressure that we can't necessarily relate to, and they make decisions the best they can with the information they have, with their own bias, influence, perspective, and goals. There's a reason that municipal managers don't run the world. Politics is a necessary part of democracy. We talked a lot about that at ICMA. The executive director gave great opportunities for that discussion where we sort of learned that. And it's true. I respect the decisions of the governing body. Does that mean that I don't at times process what my own feelings are? Sure. But my job is not to set policy. My job is to inform the policy discussion, provide options and information in an objective way to the governing body so they can make sound decisions and then to execute accordingly and then to inform them about what resources we need in order to do that in a professional way.
Yeah. And Eden, to carry that on, explaining the decision to the rank and file.
Communicating the policy decisions.
Especially if it's something that will not be well received by the workforce.
Yeah,
this is the governing body's decision. It is our job to implement whether one agrees with it or not.
Well, let me ask you about that, Brandon, because that's a tough spot for a manager to be in. If you have a department head that comes to you with a policy directive, initiative, whatever it might be that they want to see advanced, you bring it up to your governing body, they stonewall you. Are you going back to that person and saying, look, I thought you had a great idea. I'm sorry I was overruled by the board. Or are you taking ownership of that in the interest of kind of brokering the peace between your department heads and the elected officials? Because you do have to maintain that balance. Well, I mean, I'll give you an example. Recall having a conversation early on in my career with the prior board who wanted to implement a policy that exempted certain properties from having to mow their grass. This is a suburban community, kind of had an expectation of maintenance of your property. And I had a board that had a lot of environmental motivation behind their policy directives. They really just wanted to relieve certain properties from that obligation to keep your grass 6 inches or less, which I think has been the standard that's pretty common in Pennsylvania anyway.
6 inches. Just kidding.
6 inches. Yeah, I know. That's a lot.
The measure.
But the folks responsible for implementing that were, as my property maintenance code enforcement officials, came to me and said, well, geez, how are we going to do that? You got to figure out how to stop it. So when I say broker the peace, I mean, you have to be able to keep the morale high among the staff. That's one of our obligations as managers of our teams. But you also don't want to seem dismissive of their points because you serve a different authority. In my experience, it can be a delicate balance, but maybe I'm alone in that.
Take this one, Eden.
Sure. I try to promote a culture of understanding our roles and being passionate and enthusiastic about performing well in our roles and understanding what the role of the different folks in our organization, which includes the governing body, is, and respecting that. So maybe in situations a little bit more complicated than property maintenance in our communities, I can understand that sometimes our teams feel passionately about certain policy, but I sort of just on an ongoing basis promote this idea like that's not our role. Our role is to make good recommendations, facilitate conversations, and execute the policy priorities of the governing body. If they feel differently than us, we need to respect that and be prepared to execute accordingly. Allowing our personal beliefs to get wrapped up in that is a recipe for disaster. At some point, you will be disappointed. And we talk about that at the municipal manager level a lot. Like, we're nonpartisan, apolitical managers. And I always say good managers should be able to work for anybody in any governing board, a conservative community, a progressive community, a moderate community. Our personal beliefs need to be set aside, and I try to promote that throughout the team. When you have a deep bench of leaders in your organization, I try to help them be a part of that conversation and be a part of the sausage making. So we should be talking about that in public meetings, and my department heads see the conversation and understand it. It's not me having to be the broker of bad news, but they sort of saw it happen in real time.
Given the time of year and the fact that we all just reference reorganizations and getting a newly elected official, one of the things that I've always found helpful is getting to know the elected officials deeper and their motivations and interests so that I can file that away in my memory palace and say, all right, well, this person is interested in that, and this might be a policy they're to pursue as conversations happen. If there's a natural way to include, to your point, someone in on a conversation so that they're part of the process.
I think I'm a little bit more system oriented than what I'm gathering you guys are saying. To me, this is what strategic planning is all about, which should be a public process with the governing body where they should be setting the agenda. That strategic planning, those sessions, the formation of a strategic plan sets that direction. And one of the reasons that's important, Matt, is it gives you something to point to when you get those one-off directions. So in my newly elected official training that we're doing with my 2 new elected, you can't just come into the township building and say, all right, I'm here. This is a priority of mine. Let's do it. It's like, well, that's not really how this works. Like, we need the full governing bodies behind it. It should be referenced in the strategic plan. Government doesn't just do things at a snap of a finger. It's slow for a reason. These things take time. And the budget's a huge part of that. The budget is allocating resources to the policy priorities of the governing body if it's done well. And now we're sort of in execution mode, which is challenging for new elected officials who come on in January, and we're in execution mode on a document that they didn't necessarily have time to influence, and that gets more complicated when we think about pre-existing strategic plans and master plans. But I'm not really building personal relationships, say, well, what are you interested in? And then seeking opportunities to achieve that. I'm more operating within the system that these elected officials are in.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that point. I think a systems approach is important in what we do. What I'm more thinking of is our roles as translators, and that cuts both ways. Our obligation is to translate to our governing bodies the policy recommendations from our leadership team and our staff, but it's also part of our obligation to translate policy decisions made by our governing bodies back down to our direct reports throughout our entire organization. Sometimes that can be very difficult, especially when those two aren't quite aligned.
Help me understand.
Well, you may have department heads that have been doing what they've done for 30 plus years. They've got decades long careers. they come at your, strategic planning sessions, your developments of your priorities and your budgeting and your capital improvement plan. They're not bringing knives to gunfights. They know that what they're requesting is essential for the critical operations they oversee in their respective departments. So for them to hear no from you as the administrator can sometimes be news they disagree with. So I think part of when I say brokering the peace, what I mean is we have an obligation to keep our organizations running like well-oiled machines. And any real upset in that dynamic, any perception that my priorities as the director of public works are going to continually be shot down or not aligned with the governing body, right or wrong, we have an obligation to communicate through the systems approach that this is the directive set by the decision makers in this arena. So we do have to be sensitive to that. But I think there's a way that we can manage that conflict, that there's an understanding that, hey, you may have looked for, or you may have had a recommendation on this particular policy or process, but it wasn't shared by the governing body, so they disagreed with it. Maybe there's a way that we could take a different approach that is a compromised position that they will understand or that they will align with. It's all about being that negotiator, I think, when it comes to those disagreements and how we can keep things running smoothly. Brandon?
I really see it from a negotiation standpoint, because essentially it's not a negotiation.
We all have roles in our organizations and we need to do them. That includes the governing body, and we need to respect each other in those roles too. One of our jobs as chief administrators is to educate our team on what those roles are and have an expectation for professionalism. I would be significantly challenged if I was brokering the peace because a department head was displeased at a policy decision of the governing body. I'm not going to say that it hasn't happened. I think it happens in high stakes situations, but certainly there are things that department heads feel passionately about, but at the end of the day, like, it shouldn't be impacting their daily operations of their department and the administration of service.
I just don't think that's how things operate often.
I think my advice to anyone who's going through these challenges is to consider the culture that you have and the expectations that you set with your leadership and the expectations that they are setting with their team. I don't have a lot of tolerance for big emotions and feelings around significant personal disagreements about the policy setting process executed by the governing body. Like, we as municipal officials have a lot of say and influence and authority over the daily operations of our government. But if the governing body, who is the direct representation of the community, is setting a policy, our job is to execute that enthusiastically and to make sure that we are informing the discussion with them about the resources that we need or opportunity costs that we will experience in the faithful execution of that policy. People have feelings. They do have feelings. They want to talk about it, vent, all that kind of stuff. But I'm not in a position to start negotiating over the execution of public policy. That's our role, every corner of the organization. And that's the culture that I set. Do things happen that I don't always agree with? Of course. But that's not what I'm here for. The community is not really asking for my opinion. I'm not elected. I don't represent them. I moved to Middletown to be the manager here. Who am I to start negotiating over policy set by the people they elect? I'm not going to do that. And I'm certainly not going to tolerate it throughout the organization.
Yeah, I don't think we're using negotiating in the same context. When I talk about negotiations with either your staff or your governing body, I'm talking about it through the lens of how we formulate our policy recommendations. No question about it. Once that policy is set, it becomes gospel. And getting back to our textbook definition of the manager's role in public policy execution, we can all agree, at least the ones that are worth their salt, that is gospel. And that is something that we'll wholeheartedly embrace and give our full faith and effort to. But what I'm talking about is more how those policy recommendations are formulated. And I want to shift gears a little bit.
I feel like
we beat the hell out of this.
Yeah, I feel like there's a question here, Dave, that you're trying to get us to toss around. What's the core of the question? I feel like I'm dancing around something, but I'm not sure what it is.
No, I think that was it. It's well and good to say the governing body sets policy, the administrator recommends, and then we take the outcome of that policy decision and execute it with full faith and effort of the law. Talking about is where the rubber hits the road. How do we navigate all the systemic kinds of things that may result from that? And I want to talk about an example, but go ahead with your
I do have a question. Just something you said. You said the administrator recommends. Is that always true? The reason I ask,
it's not.
The reason I ask is I am aware of a colleague of ours here in Pennsylvania who will explicitly say, I do not make recommendations ever. To the point where that person's like, I don't even give options. Whatever you want to do, I'll tell you what it takes, and then we'll do it. He's like, I don't want my name in the paper. I don't want to be mentioned in the minutes on this. You're not going to see me get my hands dirty. That is up to the governing body. I am not making recommendations. What do you guys think about that?
It is a hot take, but
Go ahead, Dave. I want to hear about
you. So for me, like, I don't always give recommendations. I'll give recommendations when there is something that I can grab to formulate a recommendation. That might be on, I'll get into it. That might be based on the facts that lead up to whatever that policy decision is. It might mean based on the resources that are available to execute whatever policy decision may come from that conversation. It's got to be something that's generally concrete and objective. Where I don't provide recommendations is for things like tax policy, or for things like, let's get back to my stormwater fee, which I know, much like our leaf blowers, I've beat to death on this podcast. But I didn't have a recommendation to my governing body on whether or not to implement a stormwater fee in Ferguson Township in Center County, Pennsylvania. I left that to them. I put all of the facts and figures in front of them. I talked about all of our involvement leading up to that decision that was being made. I involved them in the process. I involved the community in the process. But when it came time to actually vote on the ordinance, I was very clear that that's not something that the manager is going to recommend. This is why you ran for office, is to set this policy. You need to decide whether or not you think this is the best interest of the community, unencumbered by the influence and bias of the manager that's in that office. So sometimes I will and sometimes I won't. It depends on the subject. It depends on the gravity of the decision being made. And it depends on how it's rooted, I think, in overall operational administration management. Brandon,
I would have given a recommendation, because stormwater fees impact the infrastructure, and it's our responsibility to upkeep the infrastructure. And if there's a tool to help us upkeep that, I would be comfortable having a recommendation on that. But we do often here in Lower Merion not provide recommendations when it doesn't really impact the operations. It's a case-by-case basis. I'll give you a quick example. We have a historic resource ordinance where historic houses can be designated as a historic resource, and there's all kinds of rules and regulations and whatnot. We recently had an application to file a house and recognize it as a historic resource that was submitted by someone who doesn't live at the house, and the individual who lives in the property opposed it. So you had an outside entity wanting to designate someone else's house as a historic resource, and you had the individual opposing it. We said, nope, we are not getting in the middle of this one. We are not providing recommendations. We will outline both sides. We will property rights side of things, the historic resource side of things, but we are not providing a recommendation on this one.
Eden, what about how it's your litmus test?
Yeah,
you
Dave,
I recommend.
I think there are situations where I disagree with you. So let me just ask a question to make sure. I know, yeah, it's a big surprise. You said that you don't make recommendations. You use tax policy as an example. You use stormwater fees as an example. We are required, I think almost every manager ordinance in Pennsylvania probably says that we have to present a balanced budget as a proposed budget to the governing body. If you have unfunded mandates, if you have a deficit, if you have anything like that that needs to be addressed in your budget, that's going to be addressed through tax policy. And if you're presenting a balanced budget, that's going to contemplate additional revenue sources, which is just a nice way of saying tax increase or fee increase or fee implementation of some kind. Isn't that inherently a recommendation? Like if you present a budget, which I'm sure you have in your career, that shows additional increases in taxes or implementation of fees, that is inherently a recommendation from the chief executive, is it not?
No, the way I approach those kinds of challenges is, number one, I'll give scenarios. And when I'm teeing up a budget that has an excess of expenditures over revenue, the way I'm going into those work sessions, the way I'm presenting that budget is, look, we're limited in what we can do in government with balancing our budgets. I mean, we've got limited tools, especially in Pennsylvania. That's right. Not so true in other states that we've had the pleasure of working in. But, in some cases where, it's a fiscal policy matter, you're raising taxes, you're adding fees. If you have an authority, you're talking about rate setting. If you've got a fund balance, you're talking about utilization of fund balance. And other times you're talking about how can we operate more leanly? How can we operate with deferred expenditures? I'll try to come prepared with different scenarios. Look, if you guys want to balance this budget, you can do so entirely on the revenue side with a $250,000 increase in real estate taxes.
Of course.
You can do so with deferred expenditures. And here's some options for you to consider. These are maybe the nice to have, not need to have kinds of things that we're okay with punting another year. We lay it out
That's
for them
good.
to,
Yeah,
right?
love all
That's
that's great.
process.
But at the
Not
end,
really a
but that's what I think I hear you saying is all of that sort of happens in the sausage making process, budget workshops and all that kind of stuff.
exactly.
Eventually, you as the executive have to present a balanced budget for consideration. In Pennsylvania, it's got to be advertised and all that kind of stuff. They vote on that. That's your recommendation. You sign your name to that, right?
Right. But
So
it's a
it's gonna
recommendation
reflect, right? It's a recommendation. That's the point.
backed by
Which is
the momentum of the
right.
sausage making,
That
right?
makes
It's
sense.
not
So I think you are making a recommendation. And by the way, I agree with that. You go through the sausage making process, you figure out their direction, what they want, because let's be practical. We don't want to go into a budget meeting where we're finally presenting the proposed budget and they say, I hate this. At that point, you're in the middle of November, the end of the year is coming. So you need all of that momentum and all the input you got in the workshops. And I think presenting scenarios, like you said, makes complete sense. That's the best practice way to do that. And so that your proposed budget shows their priorities, you are recommending that based
but
on the things that they said.
splitting hairs is important because if in the making of that sausage, my governing body says, you know what, we're going to do this on the expenditure side rather than on the revenue side, and we're going to make these cuts to the budget, and I draft that final version that's going up for their approval, it's going to be recommending whatever decisions were made in that
Sure.
sausage making process.
Yeah,
It is, I think, in a form a recommendation, but it's not necessarily one that was entirely developed in the same way that I might recommend other kinds of policy pursuits based on things that
Sure.
happen.
You're making sure that you have the support
of the
before you bring it
operation.
to a public meeting.
The support and the input, really. But let's shift a little bit,
Agree with that.
Brandon, because you have a different role in public policy formation than Eden and I do because you're an assistant CAO. Talk about when and if disagreements materialize between you and the manager in Lower Merion, Ernie McNeely, and how you kind of those out when it's your responsibility to present those to the governing body. How do you reconcile that?
Here in Lower Merion, Ernie and I serve as essentially one functional unit. Granted, like there are things that I'll work on, on the ground level that, he doesn't, but we often have conversations about different policies, especially the internal ones. We have not disagreed on anything. We're very similar in mindset and approaches. If there were ever a policy where I did disagree, that I would essentially make my disagreements known. And, very similar to how the manager takes the direction of the council or the elected officials and carries it through the organization. I view my role the same way. If the council and the manager make a decision, and that is the policy, it's my job whether or not I agree with it. I have that relationship where I can say privately to him, here are my concerns. It's up to him whether he agrees or not. The policy is the policy, and it's my job to take that policy decided upon high and carry it through the organization.
One thing I've often thought about is, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but I can certainly speak to a few examples of my own, where policies set by our local boards may be preempted by state and federal statutes. One example I can give you was in Ferguson Township, right as I was starting my career. This was 2012, October 2012. There was a referendum that was being presented to amend our home rule charter to establish a community and environmental bill of rights. You saw this from a couple of groups in the advent of the Marcellus Shale, a fracking industry in parts of the state. And I had a community group that wanted to ban basically all extraction of non-renewable energy in the township. It was kind of comical because we didn't have any Marcellus Shale in Ferguson Township, but nevertheless, they pressed on. And we also had an understanding this was a matter of preemption by the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission, by the Department of Environmental Protection. And yet I had an elected official group. They weren't really the ones driving the bus on this because this was done by referendum. It was done by community decision. But subsequently to the enactment of that Home Rule Charter Amendment, we were expected to enact policies via ordinances and other kinds of legislation that would then enforce that ban on extraction of renewable gas. And there was a non-renewable gas, and there was a number of other kind of tentacles to that Home Rule Charter Amendment. How do you navigate the conflict between local policy and state and federal as a manager? Have you ever had that come up?
Knowing the role of local government is really important. If you can do something, great. If you can't because of state and federal law, you figure out if there's some influence you can have within the limitations of local government and pursue that. But if you're wanting to do something and it's been sort of regulated, you've been regulated against being able to do that because state and federal law is sort of accepting that and understanding our role. It's a tough conversation to have and to explain, but that's where we are.
How many years has the municipalities in Pennsylvania tried to get local radar?
And we still don't have it.
And we still don't
Right.
have
I mean, remember like the plastic bag ban, single-use plastic bag ban, got started. I forget what community it started in, Westchester maybe.
Yeah,
Narberth.
Yeah, that's a good example.
And
Great
then
example.
state law basically said, hey,
Moratorium.
you got to wait. And everyone was mad and we waited.
Well-
And then eventually you could do it. And now we're here. And many communities have banned it.
And
Let me tell you
they
that
talk about a similar moratorium for leaf blower bans.
Absolutely.
But
Yes.
good
And
segue
is that
into
what-
the last
Can I
focal
circle
point
back on-
I do want to revisit the plastic bag ban piece because I think it's apropos of my last point here. Go ahead.
Brandon, you made the comment that you and your manager don't really disagree on policy, that you guys are pretty aligned. I texted my assistant manager live here, so we got a live contribution from my assistant manager. And I said, I was like, do we ever disagree on policy recommendations? Need to know for the podcast. And he said, sometimes, yes, actually fairly regularly, but we talk it out and move on, which I think is good. And we've talked previously in different episodes about the need for disagreement of thought, how we
Definitely.
shouldn't all be monolithic and aligned. So,
And I will say I have disagreed with my manager in the past. Not so much Ernie, but other managers.
You brought up the moratorium on plastic bags, and I can actually take a little bit of ownership for that statewide because the origin came from Center County, came from then Senator Jay Corman, happened to be the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And the genesis of that was a sweet elderly woman who was appointed to serve on my board in the absence of one who'd moved out of the township, named Pam Steckler. She was kind of my adopted grandmother. Wonderful woman. She's passed away now. But, she came in an appointed status, hell-bent on instituting a township-wide ban on single-use plastic bags and straws. And my message to her was, look, I know what you want to do. Let's try to do that in a deliberate way. Let's engage the stakeholders that'll be affected by it. Change is incremental. We all know that in government. Her response to me was, I don't care. I'm teeing this ordinance up. It'll come hell or high water, and we're going to have a vote on it. So she had the support from some of my board. It never got to a vote. It never made it that far, but she had the support from at least one of my other board members. She was ready to advance this. The consequence of it, as you just described, Eden, was that in comes our senator, Jay Corman. His objection was, well, we have a plastic bag manufacturer in Center County, who's, of course, right about that, in Milesburg Borough. And this is going to be very detrimental to the livelihood of that organization, the jobs that it's brought forward. He appended to the budget, this is a statewide moratorium on the imposition of single-use plastic bags. So for me, that was a textbook example of the one step forward, two steps backwards nature of some of these reactionary or overly zealous public policymakers. So I want to ask you about what is our role as managers in controlling the cadence and tempo of policy formation, because we know there is a certain amount of inertia that has to go behind the imposition of a policy, especially the ones that are more controversial. If you do it in a vacuum or too aggressively, the consequences, it might put you in a worse position than you were when you started.
I think it's understanding the groundwork and what's happening in the larger picture, which relationships at the upper levels of government, is an important part of that. Dave, I'm sure you've had that relationship with the senator to understand what the implications may be in a broader sense, and communicating that with your advisory boards, with your governing body, and making sure there's an understanding of what those implications are, allowing them to make informed decisions, right? I think a lot of what we do is facilitating a data-driven process that could influence the process. And I've said to my governing bodies, it's perfectly okay to be a trendsetter. It's perfectly okay to try to set precedent and to position the legislator to get involved one way or the other. You should just know that may be an unfolding dynamic, and what you think is only a local issue, just make sure they're informed about that as they move forward, right? I'm sure that was the conversation in Lower Merion. Dave, it sounds like that was definitely the conversation in Ferguson. Westchester University, we're still all waiting for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to issue a decision on the Westchester University versus the Borough of Westchester in terms of a stormwater fee. I'm sure they knew and were advised, the Borough Council, that was going to be sort of a precedent-setting event and that would go forth. So I think it's just sort of understanding the groundwork and communicating it accordingly.
Yeah, Brandon,
Communicating the impact on staff, right?
Yeah,
Well,
understanding
staff for
sort of
sure.
the local resources that may be tied up or need to be allocated to dealing with it. That human
Right.
resources are a part of that.
I've always thought about policy. It never exists in a bubble. There's always some kind of catalyzing event that leads to the development of the bigger kinds of public policies worth talking about on this episode. But That catalyst has got to be met with some level of inertia, some momentum behind it. The ones that I see fail most often in my career are the ones that are not representative of the community at large, the will of the constituency and the residents and the stakeholders that are going to be affected by those. That's what inevitably leads to either new officials, new elected officials being elected solely on the grounds of rescinding or revising that policy. The stormwater fee was an example of that in Ferguson Township. That inertia is so important. We did an episode on change management already, but thinking about how we as managers have got to involve ourselves in managing those changes, managing those reforms in the communities that we serve, and revisiting those, coming back to our elected officials and saying, look, we've been doing this for a year. Here's the outcome of it. It's great. It's not great. It needs tweaking. Here's why. What do you think? Kind of gets back to that negotiation position of managers. But do you do that? I guess last question is are you looking at policies in kind of a continuum and then coming back, revisiting them after they've been allowed to marinate for a while?
Think about that as the agenda of the elected body or what their policy docket is. Some things get pushed. So speaking of single-use plastic bans, I think that's going to come up in my community in 2026. There was some discussion about it in 24 and 25. It's just
You guys
lingering.
didn't do it?
Now we haven't banned it.
Surprise.
And we don't really have a lot of single-use plastic commercial. So I think there's a perception of what the actual impact of that is. But it's a priority for one of our advisory boards, and I think it'll come up, and that's okay. Timing is important. So I do think about and I document what that larger agenda of the governing body is and see how things move around with timing and the management of other priorities. I think about that and land development too. I said to a developer, I'm like, you have a project that I think would be supported by the governing body, but timing is everything, and this may not be the time. So let's talk about when the timing might be. That's a real part of what we do.
Land development's a good example, at least in the state of Pennsylvania. For those outside our Commonwealth, we are a use by right state. And if your applicant for development, and I would presume this is relatively consistent throughout our great country, if you meet the zoning, you meet the subdivision land development regulations, you're entitled to an approval. That's a hard reality for some of our elected officials to
Yeah, newly elected official training. I always say things like, you can't zone for a Wegmans and zone against a Trader Joe's. That's not how this works. When we start talking about what rights are. Yeah, it's challenging.
Sure. Brandon, any final thoughts?
No, I think we kind of hit the nail on the head on a number of different things. But yeah, you might see the whiteboard behind me. I usually just tab things that I need to revisit from time to time, policies, programs, what have you. And
Carve out a corner on that whiteboard for Generation on the Rise. The one thing we didn't really talk about is how the Generation of the Rise generation sort of approaches this. How might a manager that is maybe our age approach policy setting in their role compared to those who've been in the field for decades? But I do think when you have the depth of experience that some of our colleagues have who've been doing this for generations, the conversations they're having with their board members is going to be very different than what ours is. The Generation on the Rise managers are maybe a little bit more zealous and willing to test the limits, push the legislator a little bit, and be blunt in having some of these conversations. Whereas some of our more seasoned managers who have survived so much and have done such a good job in this industry maybe approach that differently, and what we can learn from that as the Generation on the Rise managers.
Yeah, excellent point. I know we didn't get into that for sure, and we should have. That's my fault. I'll give up one of my millennial cards when the episode is over. But I think if there is a takeaway for that Generation on the Rise, it's to listen to the three of us who've been doing this for some time and maybe realize that you got to sometimes pump the brakes. We know there's a lot of ambition, a lot of ideology that goes into this profession, but we do have to be deferent to our leadership, to the elected officials in the process of public policy formation. You just got to be mindful of that balance.
To that point, one thing we didn't talk about is what happens when we have operations that we're responsible for that really are in crisis or are not operating professionally or maybe not delivering services at the threshold that is expected. At what point does the manager start sort of forcing the conversation about, hey, like this is a failing operation, this needs to be improved, here are options in terms of what it takes, but they're going to require a lot of gut from the elected officials because there might be community blowback, staff blowback. It just may be difficult, may require a lot of funding. There are times, even in my career, where I've said, like, this may not be a policy priority of yours, but it needs to be. Here are the reasons why, forcing that conversation. I think some of the managers whose shoulders we stand on in this field may have said, I wouldn't have pushed that. There's a lot of risk associated with pushing those conversations.
And that's a good final thought. So with that, I will close this episode out. Thanks again to both of you. As always, good conversation. Thanks to our listeners, and tune in next week for another exciting installment of Generation on the Rise. Thanks a lot. We'll see you then.